Three, two, one. Oh, you know what? You're supposed to say 3, 2, 1 before you go live, but we are live. Welcome to the podcast, Super Friends, once again. Hope you enjoyed this show. It's kind of podcasting 101, podcasting stuff going on in the industry. And the 5 Super Friends come to you from around the Northern Hemisphere. I will introduce them. Actually, I'll let them introduce themselves. Matt Kundle, you are the first in the Hollywood squares on my screen, so could you please let us know who you are there?
Matt Kundle, the Sound Off Media Company, located in Winnipeg, Canada, where it is minus 30 Celsius, which comes out to like minus 10 Fahrenheit or something. Do not recommend.
We move south across the globe, all the way down to Johnny Podcast. Johnny, how are we? Who are you?
We're good. I have Johnny Podcasts and reporting live from Fort Worth, Texas, where we are getting our yearly 3 days of snow, and the entire city gets, 2 or 3 days off of work, which is nice because no one here has ever invested in snow tires. Regardless, though, I'm a podcast audio engineer and video producer, and I'm ready to just dive deep.
All right.
Into the basics of launching a podcast.
We skip on over to the Big Easy, where one of my favorite shows, Your Honor, is taking place. And I assume that you're one of the stars of that show, Catherine. But anyways.
Oh, yes. So hello, everybody. I'm Catherine O'Brien from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I'll tell you this, the weather here, the temperature might not be so impressive. It's 54, but it's humid and dank like my memes, if I can tell you that.
Good one. Well, top that, John. We've heard the weather, I think, already. So, John, Jag, Gay, maybe give us the sports. Did the Lions make the playoffs this year?
Oh, missed it by that much.
They did. They really did. Yeah.
I am John Gay from Jag and Detroit Podcasts, and my Siri watch is answering my introduction, which is nice. So I believe you can create a podcast without a studio. I can create a podcast for you with the comfort of your own home or office without having to go to a big fancy studio and pay fees for it.
Very cool. And my name is David Yaz. I am the founder and CEO of the Boston Podcast Network. It's pod617.com. In Boston, Mass, we produce out of our Westwood, Mass studios or anywhere around the globe, remotely, pod617.com. It's the Boston Podcast Network. In Pod We Trust. That's branding. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're just creating a podcast today on the show. The topic is how to start a podcast. And so before we start with some of the stuff that you're probably dying to know, like which overpriced microphone should I not buy on Amazon or stuff like that, let's start where it all begins with an idea. So if you have an idea for a podcast, we hope you're passionate about it. We hope you've given it some thought. But there's some things you should know that you maybe shouldn't do and some directions you should navigate towards. Catherine, let's start with you. What should you be thinking about when you get that first germ of an idea, or when your annoying friends tell you, you should really have a podcast? What do you do then?
By the way, has anybody ever said to somebody else, you should start a podcast? Or is everybody just like, they're telling themselves, you should start a podcast? They have this hope and this dream of podcasting. That's fine. Sure. Somebody told you to start a podcast. Sure. We'll believe that. Well, hey, if you are wanting to start a podcast, the very first thing that I would suggest, and I'm sure that my podcast super friends would also get in and suggest as well, is you really have to have the idea of your show, what your show is, and who it is for, really hammered out before you hit that launch button. And the reason for this is, as David was just saying before we started here, a show about nothing has been done. Seinfeld has that booked. You cannot say you're a show about nothing. And also, if you are a show for everybody, then you are really a show for nobody. And those are two sort of adages that we really stick by. So it's great to have a concept that is well thought out. And I have a couple of tips for people on how to really make sure that they have a concept together. And the first thing is, You should really probably think about having a podcast mission or a podcast mission statement even. Now, of course, as you podcast, as you do more episodes, that can evolve and change down the line. But if you're able to crystallize the idea down into a couple of sentences, that's going to be really formative and helpful for you to make sure that you understand what you're trying to achieve. And it's going to be kind of give you all a lot of direction on how you're going to structure your show, who you're going to talk to, what you're going to talk about. So that podcast mission statement seems like it's like a little bit of a cheesy throwaway, but it's actually very helpful. And the second thing I would really recommend that people do in the sort of the concept stage is try to come up with a podcast tagline. Now, I think that podcast taglines are really important because they are a way, just again, that crystallized idea. But if you use a tagline in what you're talking about, it actually is telling the audience a way to describe your show. So like, for example, if I say to Johnny, hey, Johnny, what is the PodLogic show about?
Helping podcasters become better podcasters.
That's a perfect tagline that it instantly tells me what that show is about. So that tells me that Johnny has done the homework of like, what is he talking about? And then if I listen to his show, I'm able, if the more I hear that tagline repeated, I'm actually able to use that tagline to describe the show to other people. So it's really about crystallizing your ideas and getting the words, the concept from this messy idea into actual words that can be articulated. So those are my two right off the bat. If you've got an idea, you're hyped, you're ready to go, get that mission statement and get that tagline together.
It's a great exercise to try to put that into a tagline, which can also, by the way, become the first thing you say on the show. Welcome to PodLogic. It's the show where podcasters help others be better podcasters. Johnny said it better than I did, and off you go. If somebody asks you what your podcast is about and you say, oh, well, me and my friend are really funny and we cover a lot of ground, you're in trouble. Turn back now. Johnny, let's go to you. Further thoughts on Catherine's thoughts and the concept for a show?
Yeah, and I love that all five of us are going to be able to chime in on this because we all work with such different levels of clientele. So we've all been involved in dozens and dozens of show launches, and so we all come at it with a different perspective. So the lens that I view this through is I do a lot of business podcasts, a lot of interview style podcasts. Clients or potential clients will come to me, and one of the first things I ask them off the bat when they want to start a podcast is I say, what's the goal of this show? Why are we doing it? And so not only should it's sort of a wrinkle within the tagline that you have or your podcast mission statement that Catherine was touching on, you need to have a goal for the show. And unfortunately, a lot of people's goals are, I want to have 10,000 downloads. I want to be the next Joe Rogan. Right. I want to be a famous podcaster. It's a fine goal to have. You can have that as your goal, but let's make that your sub goal. Let's get to step one before we get to step two. We got to crawl before we can run. The first goal that you should have really is something that's tangible. We talk about these SMART goals, things that are actionable, that are reachable, that are trackable. And again, through the lens that I'm looking at it is these business style podcasts. And the way that I try to structure, help them think about their goal is this going to drive listeners to become customers of your business? Is this going to turn guests into clients? Are we trying to get the audience to do something? Are we trying to get more notoriety for our business? Are we trying to establish ourselves as thought leaders in our industry? Maybe there aren't a lot of podcasts in the industry that we play in, and we want to be the first people and really establish ourselves in this sort of media production world. So that's step one, is to have your goal for the show. And then from there, we want to think about what kind of podcast is this going to be. And there's several different iterations, and you don't have to stick to one style of podcasting. Do you want to be a solo podcaster where you're going to be, think of like the Dr. Andrew Huberman podcast, where he just meticulously details and researches out a topic or an idea and just rants about it for 2 hours, going over data points, going over studies, going off of his own expertise? Or do you want to do an interview style podcast where there's going to be multiple voices? And once you start to flesh out these ideas, you really start to get the vision of this podcast coming together, and you go and take the next steps to actually making it a reality.
How about from the Great White North, Matt? Could you translate all that into Canadian for our listeners up there? No, your thoughts, Matt, on concept.
I usually ask, okay, what does episode 1, 2, and 3 sound like? because I think that sort of shows that they've thought about what the podcast is about and what it's going to sound like. And then I say, okay, what does episode 10 sound like? Because it has to keep going at some point, right? And so once you get through that thought process, and if the answers come back quickly, you know that they've thought about it, and you know you've got a concept that you can build around. But those first 3 episodes, followed by, you know, what's the 10th episode? What does episode 50 sound like? So I think that's just something to sort of get people thinking about what the concept is all about, to make sure that it's aligned.
Yeah, that's great.
Jag, I'm going to twist the question a little different for you. What if you are a guest-driven podcast? You're going to have terrific guests and do terrific interviews on this podcast, and I've got 3 or 4 people in mind that are going to kick it off with the first few episodes. What advice would you give to that person in terms of planning?
Well, I'm going to untwist it, David, because I had a really good point I wanted to make on the previous point. But I'll try to tie it back together. So one of my radio mentors, who his name was Ben Hamilton, he was a sociopath. He was a terrible human being, but he really knew radio. And he told us when we were doing a radio show that doing a radio show, or in this case a podcast, is like driving a NASCAR. Excuse me. All you've got to do is do your work in the pit. When the right turns green, all you've got to do is drive the car. So you want to think about your who, what, when, where, why. Who's going to be on your show? To your point, David, is it guest? Is it solo driven? Is it just 2 hosts? What's the show about? When are you going to record it? As in, how often? Where are you going to record it? In person, virtual, from a closet, from a studio, from your office? Why? To everybody's point that they've made already so far, why are you doing this podcast? So who, what, when, where, why? Have that in place before you start, and then when the light turns green, all you've got to do is drive the car and make adjustments as the situation warrants. That is so important, to just plan it out ahead of time. The hardest part is starting a podcast, so there are some people out there who will say turn the mic on and go, and just whatever you end up with, you can do that, but your quality is really going to suffer.
Yeah, I think the problem is the podcasts that we have fallen in love with, the ones that have national acclaim, often feature the personalities on the podcast chit-chatting at the very beginning and showing off how well they get along. The Smartless podcast, which many people have probably heard of, with 3 actors/comedians, is a great podcast. They have great guests and they do a little bit of chit-chat, but don't pretend you're them. You can't. You don't have the audiences of these national stars. Somewhere down the line and throughout the personality, and if you have a co-host, that will come out. But that can't be the whole show. It can't be, oh, me and my buddies are so funny. We talk about sports and beer and movies. And no, that's not enough. I like to give the example of you should have a podcast, which is, do you know what they do podcast? If you're describing a great podcast to someone, you'll often say, do you know what they do? They go back in time and they find this disease and they research the history of the disease and they tell you how it started, and it's always super interesting. There is a podcast like that. I don't know what it's called and I haven't listened to it, but it's a great idea for a podcast. It's something specific that you can put in a box. And the reason I brought up the thing with guests is the 5 people on this call, I think, will find this pattern very familiar, and that is that a client of ours comes out with a great idea for a podcast. They book the first 3 guests. First 3 episodes are great. And the 4th episode comes along, is, oh, I'm going to need an extra week for that one. Do you think it's okay if we skip a week? Okay, but try to get back on track to your regular cadence. Consistency is important. And then another month goes by. Oh, you know what? I couldn't get anybody this whole month. Everyone's Christmas vacation or something. So you should have a plan, and if possible, have a backup plan. If you don't have a guest, is there someone you can bring in as a fill-in? Can you do it up with your co-host without a guest? If that's part of your plan, then good. But if you don't have, and if you are going to go guest, do the simple thing. Get a spreadsheet, share a Google Doc with your co-host, and plan and book people out as far as you can. Get ahead of the game. Agreed? Does the panel agree? Yeah.
One quick tangent on that, David, is, the number one tune-out factor, as far as I'm concerned, for a podcast is bad audio. We'll get to that later. But for me, the number 2 tune-out factor is endless banter at the beginning of the show and inside jokes, and you come on with your co-host and say, hey, I tried a great new breakfast place around the corner. Nobody outside a 2-mile radius knows. Oh, it's freezing cold up north here today. Well, if somebody goes back and listens to this in 6 months, that's not going to be relevant in July.
Which is exactly the way we started out this show.
I know. Do as we say, not as we do.
Physician, heal thyself. Yeah.
But most importantly, you want to start out strong. Tell me why you're listening to the podcast. You don't have to come out with with a massive excitement teaser at the beginning, but tell me what you're going to talk about in that podcast, whether it's with that tagline or with a teaser for what the content's coming up. Take a 10-second clip of something from later, or just tell me in 10 seconds what you're going to cover that day. Tell me why to stick around. We have the attention span of goldfish, and if you don't give me a reason that first 10, 30 seconds to stick around, I'm on to the next.
And a lot of it is just framing it. If you say you have a movie review podcast and you say, welcome to the movie show, whatever. That's a great name for a podcast, the movie show. The movie show. And this is the podcast where we tell you about 3 upcoming films. We play a little snippet and we give you the history of the actors involved, and we tell you whether or not you should see them. If you say that up front, then maybe you can get away with a little chit chat after that, because the audience knows the first review is coming, and it better be coming pretty soon, by the way. All right. Go ahead.
Nope. That's all right. Good.
Are you sure?
No. Okay. I will say it.
No, say it.
I'm going to say it. One thing I've thought about many of the issues with launching we're talking to people who are going to launch a podcast now. Some of these things that we've talked about, like the banter and all that, older podcasts can get away with it because podcasting had a novelty. I don't think that the novelty is the same now that it was for some of these podcasts, that they got into a habit of how their shows started, or just all those things with the co-host and whatever. So maybe the grain of salt that you can take with some of the things that we're saying is that we're trying to talk about launching a podcast now, in the present where podcasting is right now. So hopefully that will kind of be a little bit more of the update to some of these concepts that we're sharing.
I think it's very true. Depending upon what stat you believe, 2 million podcasts there now. So now more than ever, have a point. As Steve Martin screamed to John Candy in Planes, Trays, and Automobiles, here's an idea. When you tell a story, have a point. Anyways, I shouldn't be so mean-spirited about it, but refine that point, find your niche. Because, by the way, just because your podcast's on the internet doesn't mean anyone's going to listen to it. And I mean anyone. I mean, if you put that, we'll get to this in a minute, building audience, but it is hard to build an audience. So don't start from behind the 8 ball with a show that is just murky and why am I listening to this? All right. We, Jag, you teased the idea of audio quality. Why don't we start with you on this topic? Because it is another thing that can sync your podcast within the first 5 to 7 seconds. And tell us why, Jag, and then give us your surefire advice for microphones and sound quality.
True story. I had a potential client that I was speaking to today, and he said, hey, I already got my hands on a Blue Yeti. I want to get started with the podcast. And I said, the first thing you do with that Blue Yeti is you throw it in the trash. And I think everybody on this call will agree with me. We've had many conversations ad nauseum about the Blue Yeti, but for anybody listening on the audience who is not familiar with it, the Blue Yeti is the best marketed, worst product out there. As Johnny, if you're watching the video, is modeling one that looks like it has a layer of dust over it. And we're going to come to this tweet from Matt here in a second. But the Blue Yeti is a condenser microphone, which means it is built to take in all of the sound around you, all over the room, including the dog barking outside and the person screaming in the next office. You want to go with a dynamic microphone, which we're all using on this call, which is built to pick up just your voice and less of the background around you. Dynamic microphone, like the Samsung Q2U, is much better. The reason Matt has pulled up this tweet, we talked about this offline before our call today. There are some folks who would say use a microphone that has an XLR connection, which is that fat little 3-pin connection you see with a microphone cord, as opposed to a USB. My answer to that, and I'll defer to the group on this, but XLRs are marginally better quality than a USB microphone. 95+% of the population will not notice a difference.
Right.
If you're just starting out, you can go with the simple, cheap USB before you worry about buying more equipment. If you have a budget and you can get a nice, fancy XLR microphone, great. A USB will work fine, but just go dynamic and not condenser is my key takeaway.
Yeah,
I tend to agree with Tessa on this thread a little bit, at least with her first microphone recommendation. If you want to split the difference and you do have the ability, and this is part of touching back onto the content side of things, is this going to be in person or is this going to be a remote style podcast? Right. If you're in the middle somewhere, you go, oh, I might do some in person, I might do some remote. Tessa's recommendation a couple tweets down is the Shure MV7, and it's a great sounding microphone that offers both USB and XLR ability. If you can get a microphone that offers both, and again, there are cheaper options, the Samsung Q2U, the ATR 2100X, that offer both. So if you are going to, thinking about your microphone strategy, that's a great thing to think about, is the XLR and USB combo, because you can do both. You can go online and you don't have to buy a USB audio interface. You can do both either way. So
Right.
throw that
I
in.
just want to read the tweet for the audio audience, and the tweet from Tessa says that if you're buying a microphone and are starting out with making content, please stop buying USB microphones, period, especially Yetis. I'm begging of you, please give this a read. And there's a thread. And if you'd like to connect to the tweet, I've put it in the show notes of the episode for the audio audience.
See, I would push back on the USB thing as Jag and maybe this whole panel kind of would, because we're here. If you're really just coming to us today and seeking advice on starting a podcast, and you're starting at square one, a USB mic is, as I think Jag said, perfectly fine. And if you plug in some of the ones we've mentioned, I know the Samson Q2U is Jag. I noticed on sale for $55 last week on Amazon. That's
There
a
you
steal.
go. Yeah.
And you want something to plug into your laptop, and you connect with someone by Zoom. You can do a perfectly good podcast that way, and it will sound mostly professional. If we follow the letter of the law of our screaming Twitter poster there, and we absolutely don't want USB, that is a step up. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but that requires, as you said, Johnny, buying a different piece, either a mixing board. You can, if you really want to go all out, and you just hit the lottery or something, and
to put it into very layman's terms, like you're just going to your absolute basics. I'm gonna get this. This is the Blue Yeti, by the way. I'm gonna get this out of the way.
Please.
I actually zoomed in on you just so we could see. Is that a Yeti?
This is the relic of all my sales calls where they say, "Oh, I have a mic," and I go, "Is it this one?"
That's a great idea.
Anyway, so essentially for the layman, just we're talking absolute basics. You've never started a podcast. You have no clue what you're doing. When we're talking about XLR versus USB, you really only need to buy one extra piece of equipment. There's tons of options out there, but they're essentially called USB audio interfaces. So this is the XLR cable here. It's going to go into another box. That box will then plug into your computer. That's how you are able to use the microphone. It sounds a lot more complicated than what we're talking about, but again, it is more expensive.
Think of it as a cable box converter. You're converting XLR to USB. That converter box is generally $100 or less. So if you want to go XLR, you absolutely can. It's just a matter of what your price point is. I would tell you, if you had an unlimited budget, spend $400 on a Shure SM7B like this one, or a Electro Voice RE20 microphone they use at radio studios. Catherine liked that. The $400 microphone, or if you want to go middle of the road, $200, $250 for the Shure MV7, like Johnny says. Or if you really are just you can't commit to a lot of money to this right now because it's a little bit of a hobby, and you want to start out for $60 or $55, I think David said, the Samsung Q2U will work as well. XLR will sound a little bit better. It's a matter if you have it in your budget to, it's the law of diminishing returns, I think.
And can I throw in my one? I am begging everybody, if you have the Blue Yeti, it is a side address microphone.
Yes.
It is a side. You are not speaking into the end of it. It is a side addressed microphone. This message has been brought to you by Dynamic
Podcast
Microphone.
producers who are tired of pulling out all the plosives from your podcast.
Now, to be clear, I admit I've never heard that term before. You mean you're talking into the side of it rather than the top?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah,
And that goes for all microphones. Whatever microphone you have, find out. A Google search will tell you, is it side address or is it end address? Talking to the end or the side, and you will sound so much better. And again, this may sound obvious, but if you have a Blue Yeti, make sure you're talking into the correct side, not the wrong side.
I admit I've once gone like a full month talking to the wrong end, and it was a good mic, so it still sounded okay. But one day I went, wait a minute, oh my god, it is a big difference. And just to clarify, if you have a co-host and you want to be in the same room together, which is certainly better for the chemistry and the energy of the show, you can't just go. You can probably, but we wouldn't recommend taking two USB mics and trying to plug them both into the same laptop. It's fraught
it's
with
a technical nightmare, with the one exception of one company that has. I actually just tried that with a client, and it actually works.
It works. Okay.
It's the Rode NT Mini microphone. Comes with its own hub and software, which I just tried with a client last week, and it works. But to your point, David, the Blue Yeti will say, you can put this in the middle of the table and have four people around it. No, you can't. Well, you can, but it will sound like hot garbage.
And the great thing about these microphones here, so what I'm for the people watching and for the people listening, I'm holding up an ATR 2100X here, and this is a Samson Q2U. They're both XLR and USB microphones. The great thing about these is, what am I doing? I don't need a boom arm for them. I can hold them. That makes them great for going off site. If you're going to be interviewing somebody or you're going to travel somewhere for the podcast, they're small, they're compatible, they're inexpensive. I can hand you one microphone. You can sit on one end of the couch. I can hold the other microphone and on the other end of the couch, and we can have a great sounding podcast. I'm seeing a lot more podcasts nowadays, especially in the comedy side of podcasts. They've moved away from this whole boom arm setup, which is great to have, not knocking it at all, but they're going super back to basics of just holding it and talking. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we can talk about having all of the great fancy stuff. The content is what matters the most, and this is going to get your content out to the masses just as well as a microphone like this sitting on a boom arm with all the fancy bells and whistles attached to it. So something to consider.
Johnny, can you do that again and just say you're a great crowd, where you're from over there?
So how long have you guys been together?
There you go. So you've started your pod. You're about ready to record your first episode. How much more do you need to plan? Do you need to have a bunch of episodes in the can before you even launch? Should you book your best guest that you could possibly think of for episode number 1? Matt, would you like to start with that topic?
So my advice with this, if you're after listeners and you want downloads, I think the best thing to do is to load it up with 3 episodes and a trailer. You should always have a trailer.
Yeah.
Minute and a half, 2 minutes, whatever it takes. I mean, the same way like a big movie production comes out, it's a 2-minute trailer. What is the show about? What can we expect? Having the 3 episodes there's a purpose for it. And the purpose is that when people finish one episode, they'll listen to the next one, followed by the next one. They might want to binge it a little bit. The next thing that's really important is that to set the expectation for when these episodes are going to be delivered. So if you're going to go every 2 weeks, don't wait 2 weeks after you've launched those first 3 episodes for the next one. Do it the next week, because we want people in the habit. We want to start to create that habit as quickly as possible. The worst thing you can do is do a whole lot of marketing, launch it, put it out there, and then give people time to forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because they will. They move on to the next thing. Right.
And Matt, what do you think about also having episodes? So you have your 3 that you launch. What about also being ahead of your release schedule? We've launched 3, so that way people can binge it. But I also have the next 2 scheduled and ready to drop. So I'm now 4 weeks out before I need to have another one recorded, produced, and ready to go.
So yes, I mean, that's always going to be better. Especially it will give you time after the first 3 episodes to say, okay, let's see how this went. What would be our next card to play? It's kind of like playing cards. There's some games out there where you're trying to get rid of your cards. You can decide what the next card is to play and what episode would really suit the stream next.
I'm a big believer in don't aim for perfection for episode number 1. I mean, come out. This is your vision. So really have fun with it. Have a great first episode. But as soon as you finish that first episode, you're going to be thinking about things you can do differently. And that's part of the fun, is you can change from episode to episode. There are certain things you do want to remain consistent on. I'm a big believer in the intro doesn't have to remain same till the end of time, but that familiarity is going to be something. It's going to be like vitamins to your audience. They're going to keep coming back and taking their vitamins. And if you change up their meds, then, they could get all screwed up.
As long as it's not the orange Flintstone vitamin. That one was nasty.
That was, yes. No,
Another thing on, like you mentioned, David, you said start with our A-list guest, like maybe, we're talking like high person in the industry, whatever. What I usually recommend to clients is especially if you're doing an interview-based podcast, start with the people that you know really well, people that you're very familiar with, that you've had several, even tens of dozens of conversations with in the past. No one starting out is this great broadcaster. I say this all the time. No one's born a great broadcaster, save for the top 1% of the 1%. This is something that you have to practice and get better at. And it is so much easier to do your first few episodes of actually having to host a show, guide a conversation, make it interesting, make it informative with someone that you know well, versus someone that you're meeting them for the first time and you go, okay, welcome to the podcast. Like it's you will eventually tap out on your immediate network of people that would be valuable to the audience that you're trying to create. But by then you will have enough reps behind the microphone to where you
That's
feel
right.
comfortable interviewing somebody for the first time, talking to them. And Matt's quote that's popping up on the screen for the audio listeners: your first 5 episodes will suck. Do you want to elaborate on that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has a vision in their mind about what the podcast is going to sound like, and it never turns out that way. I mean, I started mine. My first 5 episodes are horrible, and I think even if you do a great job, it's going to change. You get to 10, 15, 20, 25. You'll look back at your first 5 episodes and go, you know what? Compared to what I have now, those suck.
Yeah.
So it's kind of inevitable that your first 5 episodes will suck.
Isn't it Pat Flynn who says if you listen to your very first podcast and you don't cringe, then you probably did something wrong, because you should be embarrassed, at episode 100 for what it was like in that very first one. And I like to say version 1 is better than version none.
Well,
Well, that's
I don't
true.
have a single client that's gotten episode 10 that looks back and goes, man, episode 1 was great.
Great.
Yeah, and it's true. You will come out with so many great ideas, many of which you'll abandon along the way because you realize they weren't as great as you thought. I'll give a quick example. I do a music podcast called Past Tens, and we look at the top 10 hits from a given day in the past. And then I came up with this little feature. I go, wouldn't it be fun if we did this thing where we just look at the names of these 10 songs that, from 1977 or something, and we see if they fall into a certain category, and we'll call it the category, and we'll pull out an idea from the hat. And so we pull out the idea and it'll say slogans for Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. Could these 10 songs be? And then we went down and each one was either a hit or miss.
That's
And I
fun.
thought it was the most clever thing I had ever come up with. I laughed through the whole thing. After about 50 or so episodes, we had enough listeners where we could poll our audience as to what segments they liked. Dead last. The category dead last. No one cared.
Oh.
No, and so you know what? It was. I had to say goodbye to my baby, but you got to. At some point, you're going to develop an audience. At some point, you got to listen to them too. So we haven't talked yet about Zoom, StreamYard, which we are on right now. Squadcast, River. If you're going to use any of these online apps, what should you record on? And if I'm just starting out, do I just open up I don't know? Looks like my Mac came with GarageBand. Could that work or whatever? What would be your advice? Catherine, let's start with you on that one.
Oh, great. Well, one thing I just said version 1 is better than version none. I'll say that I personally, for my clients, I use Zencastr for the remote recordings. I use a Zoom or a Zoom, the device, not Zoom, the meeting video conferencing, for doing things in person. So it depends on the circumstance. And I would say that for remote, like I said, I know I've used Zencastr. Zencastr can be a little, even today I had somebody had a compatibility issue or whatever. I know some other people use other video services for recording their podcasts. I do notice, and this is actually something we have not talked about as a group, is that a lot of our podcast, let's just say companies, are now trying to be sort of like everything to all people. A lot of our companies are trying to put together video recording and audio recording and hosting and distribution and monetizing all in one package. So I'm kind of wondering how that's going to be. But for me, in person, I use a Zoom recorder and I use a mixing board to get all the different voices together. And then I use Zencastr when I'm doing remote recordings. Is that what you were looking for?
Yes, no, that is good. But I think we also want to speak to the people who don't have mixing boards. So if they, for whatever it's worth, and you guys should chime in, you can record on a number of different pieces of software that just on your computer. The Mac comes with GarageBand. There's nothing wrong with recording into that. I mean, you can record using QuickTime, right? But I think we would all advise for backups. For example, if you're recording using Zencastr, which is one of these favorite online services, great. record something onto your hard drive as well. I'm probably not describing that very well. So,
I'll
Jag,
hop
you're-
in here. Yeah,
Go.
I'll hop in here. I had a situation today where I recorded a client, and I used Squadcast. That's my app of choice. And for whatever reason, the file wouldn't generate for one of the guests. Fortunately, Squadcast records everything in a cloud backup, so I was able to use the backup copy from the cloud as opposed to the one that was recorded in session. And I have a mixing board, a Rodecaster here in my studio. I also record onto the Rodecaster. So for every client podcast that I record, I have up to 3 versions of every recording because I don't want to be, as the service provider, the one that caught my pants down figuratively to say, hey, sorry, we got to do it again. I don't have your audio. So, if there is a way to easily record a backup version for each person, we call that a double ender originally before some of these services came in, where you've got each person on each side of a remote conversation recording locally, so they have their own copy. That's going to be the most authentic copy. That said, Squadcast, Riverside, Zencaster, those are the big 3. And then Zoom in an absolute pinch. If you have somebody who is just not tech savvy and they only learned Zoom in the pandemic, I say you can use Zoom as a last resort as long as you have your settings right, which is to use original audio and have each guest on a separate track.
Now, why does that setting on Zoom say original audio for musicians now? Have you noticed that?
They've updated that so that it says, because the idea is they've had people playing music over Zoom, again, largely in COVID and a little bit since, whether it's a record artist, doing a show for a radio station online or something. So they tried to make that more clear because it was original sound on or off. Nobody quite knew what that meant.
Right.
You want to use that original sound so you have the more authentic sound as opposed to that pixelated zoomy type
Tinny,
sound.
Yeah.
That's very classic of a tech company. Oh, you needed this feature in 2020. Here it is in 2023. To kind of simplify everything that we've talked about. So, like Jag said, you can have like up to 3 backups of each recording. If we're just talking about very basic double ending, if you're not using one of these platforms that's automatically recording it, or even if you are, but you still want a local recording that is going to hold up, QuickTime Player is your absolute best option. One of my I believe it's on PC as well. You can download it, but you're right, it is majority for Mac. So one of my clients is recording on Riverside, but he also has QuickTime opened up in a very small window in the corner, recording his audio as a backup. And it is a very simple thing to do. All you do is just turn the little volume bar on QuickTime. You'll see it as soon as you pull it up. There's a volume slider. Just turn that all the way down. Make sure your mic input is set. Hit record, and then do everything you need to do on your other recording platform, and you will always have a reliable backup for you.
Can I ask, does everybody who does something in person, like maybe I'm anachronistic here, like I use the Zoom recorder in person. Does everybody use software, or are they using an actual recorder?
I can touch on this a little more because I'm doing a ton of I'm doing more in-person stuff than I think Jack does some in-person stuff as well. David too actually might be able to touch on this better. But for my in-person stuff, I have it recording to a mixing board that is also a recorder, the Zoom LiveTrack L8. That is recording all of the audio. That box needs to be powered somewhere, so I just run that to my Mac. That Mac also has Logic pulled up, which is the paid version of GarageBand, and it's recording everything as well. So if for whatever reason the box stops recording, or whatever reason Logic peters out, I have another recording happening at the same time. But David, I think the majority of your stuff is in person.
Yeah, so in my studio I do have I don't know if it's the Cadillac, because on the one hand it is the first mixing board made specifically for podcasters, the Rodecaster Plus, which does it go for $600 these days? Is that about what it is?
Down to
Dude, the
about 5
Rodecaster
because
2
there's
is
a
like
second version.
700 now. It's insane.
Yeah, but they dropped the 1 to 500 because of that. So
Get the
people are gonna
1.
Get it. Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's a revelation. On the other hand, it's also made for dummies. It's very easy to use. So if you do have the budget for that, I recommend it. And Jag, you told me you did this. I started following you. Instead of using the Rodecaster as a backup, I use it as my primary recording, because that way I know everything that's coming into my board is being recorded. And I admit I use Zoom because I like the ease of scheduling. Everybody in the world knows how to use Zoom now. So for especially if it's a guest that's a one-timer, just get on Zoom. That way they're coming into my board, and then I can clean up the audio later if necessary. I use Descript. It's one we haven't mentioned yet. It is, I think we all love it to certain various degrees. It is worth exploring. I won't say it's terrifically easy to use, but once you get the hang of it, it is a transcription app, but also an editing app. And you can open the app, you can hit the little microphone icon and start recording anyone who's coming through your board, anyone who's coming through Zoom. And there's a feature on there called Studio Sound. It's so good, I almost don't want to tell everybody about it. Jag told me about it first. But
I need to interrupt you there, David, because the Studio Sound, the script is frequently updating that software. And I have had an issue lately where they overcompensated for sibilants and they cut off S's. And I've had a number of recordings that I've run through Studio Sound where the S's have dropped off. So if you're using a service like that, please don't set it and forget it. You'll want to check your audio, and you might have to mix and match the original audio and the finished audio to not lose any letters. That's a real cautionary thing to let our listeners and viewers know about.
It happened to me once too. Someone said to me, "Your guest sounded like they had a lisp. Like, does that person have a lisp or a stutter or something?" And I was like, "No." And I listened, and I presume they fixed that, Jag, because that was unfortunate.
There's a secondary one that I'll mention while we're on the topic, and that is Adobe. Adobe now has Adobe Podcasts, and they have played with it, and the link is podcast.adobe.com, and they have a tool that will enhance your audio as well. And that is a tool that I've been using lately, and I'll share that with our listeners as well. So it's podcast.adobe.com. They have some cool tools there. They also have a mic check there as well. If you were setting up a call and weren't sure if you got the right mic selected or you're not close enough too far away, there's a free mic check tool on there at podcast.adobe.com.
Adobe, not a sponsor of the podcast. Super Friends, if you want to be mentioned again, Adobe, call our people pronto. Matt, did you want to chime in on any of this technical stuff, or should we move on?
Catherine, I use a Zoom H5 when I record in person. I've actually just loaned it out to a client right now. That's what I'm comfortable with. I tried doing some radio imaging on it. It's not good for that, so don't do that. I think any one of those platforms, I think there's a lot of discussion, Squadcast versus Riverside versus Zencaster. They're all great. They're always working to better their products. The only flag I have is when a client says, "Oh, I'm going to do them on Zoom," and I said, "Well, okay, we have to have a talk." And the talk is that between a weak internet connection can really sink this. And yes. I haven't really heard a podcast that was done on Zoom that didn't sound like it was recorded on Zoom. Nobody likes to hear that, but I say it anyway.
Are you
going to defend this, David?
Well,
David just said the backbone of his business is built on recording. He
loves Zoom.
I don't use the recording that the Zoom app actually records. That is my backup. But I will use Zoom to connect. And to me, if the person, and this is maybe a good takeaway from this whole discussion, is if you're connecting remotely with someone, half the battle is whatever microphone they have on the other end. If they're just talking,
they even have one,
right? They're just talking to their computer. I mean, no matter what app you use, it's not going to help. Although I will say that the reason these guys are fighting me on Zoom is Zoom won't record your guest on their end, and therefore it will be fuzzy to some degree. So I surrender. I don't have a white flag to
listen. People do not listen to the podcast and can pick that out the way I do. I'm the only one. Like, I can hear that, but I'm not like most listeners.
And the real quick tech explanation, tech-wise, for what David is saying is Zoom records it over the internet. These other Zencaster, Riverside, Squadcast platforms, they record your audio locally and then upload it after it's recorded, which is why, to Matt's point, if you have a weak internet connection and you have buffering or stuttering, that's going to be taken out in those other platforms. It's going to stay in Zoom.
Right.
Let me go in a little,
like one of us.
Let me go in a little bit on like what David was saying about Zoom as in terms of ease of use. Yes, he's correct. It is much easier for people to just click on a link on Zoom. But if you really want to go all in, you can make your life easier and the life of your guest a lot easier by providing a one sheet of what I call for guest appearances. So let's say that we're setting up a podcast on Riverside. Here's an example of what your one sheet would look like. Link to join, you paste the link for them to join. Here's exactly what you're going to see on Riverside. You're going to see this window pop up that says, please select whether or not you're wearing headphones, parentheses. Please make sure you're wearing headphones. Make sure that you're using Google Chrome only. That is the best platform, or that is the best web browser to use Riverside. Please make sure also you have a very strong internet connection. From here, you're going to be prompted to allow your computer to access your camera and your microphone. Here's what it'll look like. You can build out the steps to make it as easy as if someone were just clicking on a Zoom link. And everyone may not read that, but as long as you offer that to the guests, you're going to make their life a lot easier to be able to join a lot of these platforms. Like David said, not everyone knows how to just jump on a Squadcast like all of us would. Like if I were going to interview Jag, I said, hey, we're going to do it over Riverside. He knows exactly what to do, but make it easy as possible. And you can just copy and paste that into all of your calendar invites for when you're inviting guests to come on the podcast.
It's a good point. And then you could put other stuff in there that, like, if you have pets, maybe better to leave them in the other room. Things like that. That some
small
people...
room, no windows. Turn your
room
computer
temperature water
notifications off. Turn your phone off.
Cold water will sink you. That's a great point, Catherine. Cold water will freeze up the muscles in your jaw. Don't go cold water.
Jag, my notes are failing me here, but you were going to talk about movie trailers in some degree, and I'm not sure what that means. I'm sorry. Could you, do you know?
I'll defer to Matt here because he alluded to it, and that is having the movie trailer, the trailer for your podcast. It will serve as a teaser so that you can have a quick sample if somebody's want to commit 30 or 45 minutes to you, but also it gives you a taste of what's to come. And also, if you create the trailer first, you can go ahead and get your podcast on Apple and Spotify and all that before you do a full episode. Or if you're creating your trailer after you've recorded a couple episodes, you can make it a real trailer and put clips of episodes in there, little 10, 15-second clips to really give potential listeners a taste of what the show's about. Matt, do you want to pick that up from there?
No, because you pretty much just nailed it all. I would say that one of the things you can do if you make a trailer is at the same time make a promo for the show. It can be 30 seconds. Really just a very short version of what the podcast is about, where you can find the podcast, put your website in there, and you can use it to, as a promo swap down the line. There's going to be some other people that will say, hey, do you have a promo for your show? Maybe we should swap promos. One little hack, by the way, out there is like Libsyn has a podcast called The Feed with Elsie Escobar and Rob Walsh. They are looking for show promos. That is free promotion for your show. Take advantage of things like that.
What do you recommend in terms of a trailer, in terms of a call to action? Is there something you need to say during that trailer? By the way, all this advice is great. And that's why I recommend doing an episode or two in the can before you create the trailer, because you can lift audio from those first two episodes that might be gold. Everybody's funny when you take their funniest, 23 seconds of in an hour, right? But what about the call to action? Does anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I usually just suggest to send people to Apple, Spotify,
So wherever you find your pods. Right?
No, not that. Because it could be YouTube, and some people find their podcasts in funny places. So Tom Webster kind of beat that out of me and got me to stop saying that. But I think at the very end, whether it's Apple, Spotify, I think the last thing has to be your website. And we should probably talk at some point. You need a website.
Yeah.
Don't get too crazy with the calls to actions. People go and follow me on Twitter and go make sure you sign up for my email newsletter and make sure you do this. You give them analysis paralysis. They're going to go, I have so many things I have to do that I'm going to end up doing none of them. So
those are the radio doggy commands where you give them so many things to do, they don't even listen anymore.
I've actually started to tell clients we have one call to action. That's the most effective thing. You get one for the whole podcast episode.
What is
it? Doesn't have to be.
I was going to say forced to choose, Catherine. What if someone says, well, I have Twitter, I have Facebook, I have a webpage. What should my call to action be?
Well, let's go right back to what Johnny started. What is the goal of the show? So like I have clients that their list is their biggest asset. So we have a link right in the show notes to get on their email list. We have like a lead magnet, which is like a freebie for that people get for going on the email list. That's a perfect call to action that I find is very effective for a lot of my clients. What is the goal? And I would say for most businesses, list building is really good. Going to the website, and then of course, you can always do make sure that you are following or subscribe to this podcast. Those are all really great things.
I say website, and everything's on the website.
What's
okay.
what are your thoughts, Matt, on creating a separate website or using a service like Podpage or something like that?
Yes. And listen, I only say that because I'm just happy somebody actually does a website, because a lot of people will just, refer to the host's website, or, where your podcast host is, like the Anchor site or the Libsyn site, and say, oh, there's my website. Podpage I like. There is going to be some people who know Google and SEO well enough to know that it's Podpage, which populates the show from the RSS feed, probably doesn't get the proper hits in the search traffic that it does. There's a little bit of argument about that. I know the people who make Podpage would argue against it, and I know some other people would say no. But I'm all for an organic website that you create yourself. You should have blog posts for each episode. So each episode gets its own page. You should have a player up there, as well as your full description to let Google know, hey, we had
And a
Taylor Swift on our
transcript.
we had Taylor Swift on our podcast.
Did you really?
Yeah,
Let's say for
and I know you mentioned transcript, and yes, listen, a transcript is nice, but when you're starting out and wanting to launch a podcast, the website doesn't have to be the first thing. It doesn't have to be in the first batch of things we need to do. The transcript doesn't have to be in the first bunch of things we need to do, or else we'll really get bogged down, because I think we're trying to focus on a launch. And when we're focusing on a launch, there's sort of a part A and part B. And sometimes okay, we'll worry about the website next, right? Some people, we can do it beforehand, but we'll worry about the transcription a little bit later.
Can I plug something really quick?
Go for it.
There is a podcast hosting site called Co-Host, and within Co-Host, they offer you a custom podcast website that will be made for you. And it's very similar to Podpage. You can add your Twitter account to it. You can add your YouTube page to it, but it will populate all of your episodes as they go live. And we're talking about launching the podcast. Like Matt says, you may not be like, all right, well, okay, so you're telling me I got to launch a podcast. Now I got to go learn how to do WordPress and embed my player and transcript and all that stuff.
Right.
You can start with something very simple like that. And essentially what Matt is saying is, like, you just want to you want to send somebody somewhere.
As long as they can find your pod. And that's why we haven't mentioned the extremely basic thing, which is choosing a platform. It's the first thing you need to do. And that is on a site like Libsyn, Buzzsprout, or Simplecast. Jack, did you have something you want to mention about
No, I was just going to say I use Simplecast for my clients. Full disclosure, I'm a referral partner of theirs. I know everybody in this call, I think, uses different hosting platforms, which if everybody want to go around the horn maybe and say which ones they use. But personally, I've been with Simplecast for a while and I like them.
I use a service called Adori. They're small, lean, nimble, and innovative. I guess that's all I have to say about Adori.
I use
I'm-
Libsyn. Yep.
I'm on Libsyn, Transistor, and Co-Host.
I'm on Art19 and Megaphone. Both of them have dynamic audio insertion, which is why I use them. Nobody here mentioned Buzzsprout, which is incredibly popular.
Thought I did.
Captivate is another one that's very good. And I think we would all agree that a lot of them are very good. The outlier would be Anchor, which is free. And I want to listen. Nobody dislikes Anchor more than me. But let me say one thing about it: that if you do, want to start your podcast there, that's fine. At some point, because you can move it. If you don't like your podcast host, you can move it to another podcast host
Without having to start over.
Yeah,
Right, for
exactly.
sure.
And you can keep your followers. So you can just redirect the podcast if you don't like your podcast host after you first start. No problem. It's not a failure to launch, and you don't have to start over. You can just move it to another host.
Right, which can be a little tricky, but when it works well, it works.
Ask one of us if you need to do it.
Yeah, exactly. I've had ones where I've had to move and then move it back to the previous platform. Try doing that and then trying to figure out where the hell the podcast is. So we are up against the clock here, but I suppose maybe just one random question, just 90 seconds on this. YouTube.
There's no time limit. Who has to be anywhere? It's a podcast. We can go as
I've
long
got
as we want. Do we have
I allegedly have a life, but should you be on YouTube? Because I think 2 years ago, if we had this, we would have said don't bother. And now I think our answers might be very different. Quickly, do we want to talk about that? Anyone want to talk about YouTube?
The answer should be a resounding yes. It
Yes.
doesn't matter. You done now. We're not saying that you need to go buy a multi-camera setup and learn how to do video production. We're not saying just because you're starting a podcast, you now have to become a camera star. you can do audio only for YouTube. The simple fact that a lot of people may want to ignore right now is that YouTube is huge for podcast consumption there. And it doesn't screw the idea that whether it's a podcast or not, the show is being consumed on YouTube at a growing clip, and it's going to keep growing as time goes on. So by saying, oh, well, it's not a podcast, so it doesn't need to be on YouTube, you're just shooting yourself in the foot, whether it's for the discovery, the potential audience, or simply the SEO. Your show / podcast needs to be on YouTube. Video is a whole different animal. People enjoy watching the video of podcasts. I don't know what it is. People like to see people talking into microphones, but video podcast consumption is very much a popular thing. So it's something to consider. I always recommend to clients, let's nail down the audio side first. And then if you're really, really committed to doing this, let's move into video.
Yeah. And what we're talking about is you can just have a static image of the logo of your pod and have it on YouTube. And that is far better than not being on YouTube at all. In fact, I'll shout out to the platform that I use. Adori has a function where you could do that with a single click. You click and it uploads to your whatever YouTube channel you're signed into. I imagine a lot of these other platforms will start to feature that as well.
I use Headliner to create small social clips from the audio that have the transcripts with the words light up as the people are talking.
Yeah.
And I have for a couple of my clients set up an auto post to YouTube. When I hit publish or a schedule post to go up, my podcasts always publish at 6 a.m. weekdays, and then by 7 or 8, it's on their YouTube channel just automatically with no muss, no fuss. And remember, Google owns YouTube. How many times have you Googled how to do something and you get 30 YouTube videos in your search results? That's why it's so big. You want people to find stuff based on what they're Googling. They want your show to come up. YouTube's the best way.
Plus, I think right now we're at a sea change moment. I put out a tweet and we talked about it with my super friends here about, I went to a meeting with a bunch of marketers who know podcasting, they know what's happening in media. And all of the young professionals said, I listen to my podcast on YouTube. And I just kind of filed it in my mind. And I thought, I bet I'm going to be reflecting back on this moment a lot in the future.
Yeah, I keep hearing that as well. And I keep wanting to ask why, but it's not for me to say. People are consuming it on YouTube.
David, I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because it is much harder to get somebody onto a new app that they're not used to being on.
Correct.
Everybody and their mother is used to being on YouTube at this point, whether it's the web or the app. It's a lot easier to fish where the fish are. And for folks who haven't migrated over to Apple or Spotify or one of the others, be where they are. Meet them where they are.
Okay, so I have a question for Catherine. So for those people that you spoke to, the young professionals who say they consume their podcasts on YouTube, do they have like the YouTube Premium where you pay the money and then you can shut down the video and then listen? Like
that is through the power of my investigation. That's what I determined.
Because I don't see too many people going, excuse me, I'm just listening to a podcast right here.
With
Yeah,
my
no,
eyes.
it's to me, it's more. It makes sense that they find the podcast through YouTube, and then if they're sitting on the couch with their iPad, sure, maybe they continue to listen to the podcast on YouTube. But I don't know. There are millions of people, zillions of people who listen in their car or at the gym. And I just think it's not that easy to listen on YouTube. But again, I'm pro YouTube. Get on there one way or the other.
And I'll say this. I think what has happened is we went through the cord cutting phase. So people dropped cable, and then now we have streaming services. And then people realized, wait a minute, I'm paying for 10 different streaming services. This is far more than anything I was ever doing with cable. And so now I believe also just with economics is, the climate is people are cutting back. So they're trying to drop the extraneous services. So if they get a YouTube Premium, because they can get shows there, they can get different things there, they are making a choice. They're making their pick, and YouTube just has more than some of these other services.
Well, and think about how much more the visual aspect of content consumption is being added into these podcasts. Like, David, imagine if your show was on YouTube and instead of playing the 10 or 15 seconds of music for that show, you're pulling up a video alongside your heads of the live concert from 1972 of whatever band was popular at that time. I wasn't even remotely close to being alive at that point. But
calm down, Johnny.
But you'll see
I'm
like
the old guy. Come on.
You'll see like you'll see people pulling up memes on their podcast. They have video drops to have inside jokes on their podcast.
Yeah.
They're pulling up a dozen different things that add the visual component to the podcast that sort of isn't as enjoyable to be consumed when it's audio only. And so that is another kind of wrinkle in this whole YouTube era that things are moving into.
And I mean, even some shows that I watch on YouTube, they treat the audio only as like a, well, hey, here's a little lanyap for you, just a little, for those who, that they view the YouTube thing as the main, and it's like, oh, I guess we'll offer this extra piece for you if you're just listening audio only. Plus, I think that remember, the way you consume YouTube is not necessarily how everybody else is consuming YouTube. Is that there's plenty of people who have YouTube just running in the background the same way we might have an audio podcast running in the background. It's not, it maybe isn't the focus. Plus, like Johnny was saying, I think we might be underestimated because we come from podcasting 1.0, is that we might be thinking people enjoy even just seeing the face, or just some of the podcasts that are very popular with their podcasts on YouTube. It's not some huge production. It really is just
Talking heads.
It's talking heads, and they're fine with it. It's back because people are being engaged by what they're talking about.
That's right. And for those that don't speak Creole or live in New Orleans, lanyap means a little something extra.
A little extra. Yeah. So the audio is just a little extra. It's just, it's not the main dish. It's the extra.
It's a great word. I used to use it all the time, but not everybody knows what it means. I guess we should wrap up. Do we want to go around the horn and remind people where to find us?
Can we touch on two things quickly that we didn't hit on that are key to the podcast launch? Cover art music. You need licensed music. You can't pull your favorite song from Spotify to use as your podcast music. So I would everyone here uses different stuff. I would recommend premiumbeat.com for your music. You can buy a song for like $50 and it's yours to use for your podcast. And then Cover Art, Fiverr, Upwork, freelancing websites and search for podcast cover art creation. That's where I have one guy that I send all of my clients to, and he does a great job. Or you can use things like Canva. If you're versed in Illustrator or Photoshop, you can use those as well. But those are things that you have to consider as well that we didn't touch on. For
music, I would recommend megatracks.com. I have a relationship with them. For artwork, a reminder, there are some specs you'll have to follow: 3,000 by 3,000 all the way down to 1,400 by 1,400. Do not put the Apple logo in the artwork, or you will not be approved by Apple because you're not approved to use that. And
good point.
And don't put a microphone in your your art.
Yeah, can we stop that, please? No microphones in artwork.
How will they know it's a podcast?
Very good. Very good. Do we say goodbye in any fashion here, or should we remind people where to find us? I'm Dave in Boston, pod617.com.
Matt Kundle, soundoff.network.
Follow me on Twitter at Johnny Podcasts.
Hi, I'm Catherine O'Brien, and I'm Branch Out Programs is my company, and you can follow me on Twitter too. Hello, Catherine O.
John Gay, Jag in Detroit Podcasts, jagindetroit.com, or any social media, Jag in Detroit.
And just remember, we know your podcast is going to be super, and we want you to be our friend. So join us next time with the podcast Super Friends. We now return to our lair in the Hall of Justice, and we'll see you next time.